We're live. Welcome to Science Sunday. Thanks for coming out. We've got a nice group of 10 or so people in the audience here, and a lot of you at home. I know last time I looked at the numbers a few days after the science talk 2 weeks ago, and we ended up with 66 people watching online. So that's a nice feeling, and it seems like we're coming back with more people coming into the service group area here and joining in Science Sunday. So thanks so much for coming out in person or at home. Welcome to all the science lovers in the area. We took a vote in the area here, and we all agreed that it's fine to wear a mask if you choose to, but we voted that it was allowable for everyone in here that chose to take theirs off as well. So you'll see not much masking going on here right now. Other than that, we want to thank this church, the DUUC Church, that provides us with this space and this opportunity, and the AV team and so on that lets us talk about science, some of the things that we're passionate about, twice a month, first and third Sundays of the month, and we welcome you to come in, and happy to be here. This is, I believe, our 11th year of doing this, and it's been a long, fun ride. The church provides some parts of their organization that opens this up for us, and they also they support us in their concepts of what they're looking for. A search for truth and meaning is one important part of the church, and a relationship with the world, of which we're just a small part. So these things fit into their way of looking at things. I probably will talk a little bit later about a Washington Post article that I'd recommend, but if it doesn't come up, you maybe want to look at a Washington Post article that talks about the Potsdam Conference that came up with some really interesting points, and I know John Farmer's nodding his head. He's aware of it a little bit too, but I want to get Mike onto the stage pretty quick here to talk. Just to celebrate the fact that we're talking about climate change, which has been some of the best attended science forums that we've had here. I rode my bike in to work today, or to Science Sunday today. So it was a little bit of a cold ride, but I think we need to start making some changes about how we look at the world, and I think most people realize that. And I know it kind of reminded me of the time that Mark and Dave Gorman and another Mike rode with me out to Washington, D.C. for a climate lobby conference. And so, yeah, I think bikes are a good part of the solution to it, and we'll find out a lot more from Mike Zanillo today. So today we asked Mike Zanillo, who's an economist from the University of Chicago, to present. He represents the Citizens Climate Lobby, which we've had very good commonality with at times. Mark Ailes has talked about that, and they were big supporters of our bike ride out to Washington, D.C. But the Citizens Climate Lobby has some really innovative, interesting, demanding, challenging techniques of how we can do this. They're a nonpartisan grassroots organization working for a livable environment, and I think that's something that's a great goal. And so without any further ado, I'd like to ask Mike Zanillo to come up and present and talk about Citizens Climate Lobby and climate change. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I apologize, because I actually came down to downtown Chicago when you and Mark were heading off to Washington, D.C. to kind of see you off, and
That's right.
I didn't make the connection. So Thanks for doing that, and thanks for the introduction. And Mark, thank you for being instrumental for getting me here today. So certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here and making the church available to what I obviously believe is a very important topic. And without any further ado, let me just kind of quickly get into, from an agenda standpoint, what I threw together, because I certainly appreciate everyone taking time on a busy Sunday, coincidentally with time during a Bears game, and we'll actually make some few connections to football along the way here that I've kind of worked in. So what we'll talk about is kind of just setting the goal for what the climate challenge poses to us. So we'll kind of, we're not going to get a lot into causes or impacts, but we are going to cover it enough because we really want to spend most of the time talking about what needs to be done about the problem. And I think we have to understand the problem to a certain level and certainly understand what's the what's the extent of solution needed? So that's really what we want to talk about for the majority of the 50 minutes. And then we'll the good news, and I've been doing this for a few years, and that second agenda item hasn't been around for a while, but I'm glad to report that it now is a topic. And we'll cover briefly what a lot has been done in the last couple of years, and we'll kind of put that in terms of how much of a contribution does that make towards the solution. And then we'll kind of talk about going forward, about where do we really need to get to, does anything more need to be done, and if more, what do we think is the most logical, effective thing that can be done. So without, like I said, keeping this definitely at 100,000 foot level, if you know anything about climate change, you probably know the term greenhouse gas. And what a greenhouse gas is something that has the characteristic that when the energy from the sun, which is really the source of the majority of energy for the earth that grows our plants and warms our atmosphere, it allows visible light to pass through unimpeded. But whenever that energy hits the roof of this building, the roof of my car, or a sidewalk, a good chunk of it wants to reflect back. But when it reflects back in the infrared portion of the energy spectrum. And that's where the definition of a greenhouse gas is that it has a very inhibiting factor for blocking infrared energy, and hence the problem. When you don't have it in the atmosphere, a good chunk of the energy of the sun would effectively bounce back into space. But the more and more you have of a greenhouse gas, and the fact that we have some is very important, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next few slides, but carbon dioxide is the one we're going to be talking about. And it is naturally occurring and always has been in the atmosphere. And to the extent that it's there in a small amount, and we're talking about 0.04%, that's defined as kind of the naturally occurring level. Not much, right? 0.04%. But that in and of itself results in, generally speaking, 60 degrees of warming. So if we didn't have that little bit of naturally occurring greenhouse gas, huge portions of the earth would be uninhabitable. For all intents and purposes, things would be generally 60 degrees cooler on average. And life as we know it wouldn't exist like we know it to be. So the fact that we have a little bit is a good thing, but it's also a testimony to the power of it, that even though it's there in such a crazy small amount, it does have that effect, and hence that's the problem, because, as we're going to talk about, man's activities are affecting it. So the sources of carbon dioxide are many, from curing of concrete, from burning of crops and changing land use. There's a whole bunch of causes, and we're not going to get into that because I always tend to be a very simple person. So if you can't, very often when I worked at Motorola, we kind of developed a whole lot of quality processes, and we always learned to go after the first Pareto item. So at the end of the day, 80% of man-made emissions result from one thing, the burning of fossil fuels. So while there's a lot of other causes that are interesting to talk about and different groups kind of focus on, and that's all good, to me, if you don't get your arms around the elephant in the room, the 80% of the problem, you're probably going to be disappointed at the net result. So 80% of the human contribution of CO2 is the result of one thing, the burning of fossil fuels. So if you then kind of, and this is a plot and it may not be real readable when you're far away from the screen, but this is basically a plot of CO2 levels in the atmosphere while humans have walked the earth for the last 400,000 years. And you can see by the yellow line, it does bounce around a little bit, and that coincides with ice ages. But at the end of the day, during those 400,000 years, the general average has been 280 parts per million. So for all the time that mankind has walked on the earth, the average level, subject to some minor gyrations, has been around 280 parts per million until you get to the red hockey stick part, which coincides with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when man's activities have really amped up the burning of coal, oil, and gas, and throwing huge amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, where you can now see we've hit 421 parts per million and going up in a very measurable way every year. So that's the hockey stick. So that's the problem, if you will. And then another way of looking at it, and here again, I'll kind of walk you through the slides because I'm sure they're not readable, but the pastel colors of the area chart are basically the yearly emissions that result from the burning of coal, oil, and gas. Coal's the green, oil is the yellow, and gas is the blue. And you can see how, we steadily increased. Recently, we've, in fact, have reduced it, and that's a good news. But at the end of the day, what this chart doesn't show, and it's a very important factor, is that the emissions in any one year, and obviously I'm going to reduce a lot of complicated science in the interest of time, the vast majority of those emissions continue to reside in the atmosphere. Basically 60% remains in the atmosphere and doesn't get absorbed anywhere else. So there's this cumulative effect. And there's a lot of science that says that gas we put into the air will minimally stay there several hundred years. I think there's been some studies that have said 2,000 to 3,000 years. But with this chart then, a more appropriate way of looking at it, I would argue, is that while this chart plots the yearly emissions, you basically are adding to all prior years. So the cumulative effect has been building up steadily, and that's what basically gets us to the point where we are now, where we now have 43% more CO2 in the air than we would have naturally. And that's, the 421 parts per million that was on the prior slide compared to the naturally occurring 280 parts per million. So all that warming then kind of results in that red line, which is a plot of average global temperatures, where we now have basically realized on average, and this is always based on an average because different locales have different effects, but generally speaking, on an average sense, the Earth is 2 degrees warmer today as a result of that 43% increase in CO2. That's the result of burning the fossil fuels. So the key takeaway on this slide, and I'm going to highlight along the way some of the key things that I would really encourage committing to memory, is that CO2 does last in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. The rate of warming, because of the cumulative effect, is doubling. So when you calculate it out on a decade basis, the rate of warming has actually doubled recently from prior decades. And we are already, on average, 2 degrees warmer than we otherwise would be, except for the burning of fossil fuels. So, climate change, and we're going to talk now about some of the effects in different ways, because I've been doing this a while, and very often I just, in the back of my mind, it's probably a terrible thing to say, I very often don't feel I connect or convey it effectively enough, because I would imagine that there's, some well-meaning folks that think about this, and they think about going into January, and they go, what's wrong with a couple degrees warmer? Wouldn't that actually be a good thing? And I can certainly appreciate that for anybody living in Chicago saying, well, I'd rather have a 5 below zero day than a 10 below zero day, right? Who wouldn't want that? But at the end of the day, I think we really need to talk in terms of what is the effect overall, not just locally, and how in an affluent society such as ours we can cope with that. But at the end of the day, what does these kind of temperature changes mean to whole, large swaths of the world that are living, basically, I won't say paycheck to paycheck, it's worse than that. And then to throw in a disruption by having interruptions to food crop productivity and a whole bunch of things. So, there's a lot of different ways. We've seen the floods in Pakistan that have been unprecedented. We all know about western wildfires. We all know about melting glaciers. So there's all different ways of thinking about it. We're going to kind of focus, and before we get to some of the focus that I want to kind of talk about in more quantifiable ways, there's a good news opportunity here, and that is where we still can control the problem. Because what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this time period is an opportunity I'll present it as for us to really get our arms around the worst of the problem. But, a hidden little nasty truth is that if we're not careful, and that's really what kind of drives a lot of scientists to set the goals that they do, is because there are scenarios in which it becomes uncontrollable. So that's really what the thrust of a lot of the actions we're talking about, and a lot of the guidance we're going to talk about from the scientists and the IPCC and stuff, is really doing our best to make sure we can remain in control of the problem. Because the worst case scenario is being able to lose control. And on this chart are some of those things like the melting of the permafrost, which would in and of itself release huge amounts of greenhouse gases that once the earth warms and things start melting, you can't kind of put the genie back in the jar. And there's, all sorts of things with ocean currents and, obviously just generally speaking from an Arctic sense, wherever you have an ice cap in and of itself is highly reflective of energy back off the, just as on a cold winter day, the sun just kind of hits the snow, and a lot of that's why you have the coldest days after fresh snow falls, that obviously as the snow melts and you start changing the composition of the Arctic Circle where it now has blue water, those become kind of feedback loops because you're losing that benefit of that reflectivity, and that again amplifies and goes beyond just what the normal warming effects would be of CO2. So, just kind of making it a little bit more personal, and I know some people, think these are bad, and other people might actually sit and say, hey, it's not too bad. But, the prospects are that if we don't do anything different, Chicago would basically have what we always used to typify as a climate of Alabama. So basically, business as usual, no attempts to reduce emissions would mean that the U.S. would be, the Chicago area would basically be like Montgomery, Alabama, basically 9.1 degrees warmer on average. These next few slides, I'm just going to kind of go through really quick. Because the main point here is I would encourage everyone here who has an interest to do their own research. So the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration has a wonderful website where they have nauseating detail on what has been the effects of extreme weather events yearly for the last 10, 15 years. Because, all this kind of gets blurred, right? We're now talking about tornadoes in the end of November. We're all almost getting accustomed to wildfires 10 months a year in California and what have you. But if you kind of go through these slides, and they got one for every year, it kind of brings back to memory about, hey, remember that really bad Hurricane Harvey that hit Texas a few years ago? And it just really kind of refreshes your memory, because the good news is we're getting more coverage of events than ever in the news. The bad news is, like a lot of things that happen that are bad, you almost get numb to it, right? And almost, it's like, normalizes it. So I would encourage you, at a minimum, go into a lot of sites. This is the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration one. Here are 4 other of my favorite sources that, I obviously try to, we obviously live at a time now where there's a lot of skepticism of new sources, so I try to have things that I'd like to advertise are beyond reproach. So NASA site, which is obviously all fact-driven and all evidence-driven, is a wonderful source to turn to. I've already mentioned the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration. Locally, I would actually recommend the Climate Impact Lab. That's driven by a couple sources close to home here between the University of Chicago and Argonne, along with Berkeley. But what their little claim to fame is, they'll allow you to drill down on effects on a county-by-county basis. So they actually use the computing power of the supercomputers at Argonne that allow you to do a projection based on your county, whether you live in DuPage, Kane, or wherever, and really kind of get a real feel for what are the expectations of change in a very, very local sense. And then the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I'm not going to go through this because, there's so many things you can quote, you probably won't remember it by the time you get home. But these are 4 very reputable sources that I would say, poke around, do your own research and see what you think. So, at the end of the day, like I said, there's a lot of different ways to talk about the problem. My personal biggest fear is the one that, like I said, I think talking to Americans about the change in weather isn't as dramatic as maybe some of us would like it to be. But just thinking about the social disruption that it's going to unleash in many different parts of the world and different countries. A lot of folks would say a good chunk of the Syrian conflict that went on for years had its origins by the Syrian farmers losing their means of income because of climate change impacting yields within their area. A lot of our problem at the southern border, you can peel it back and look at it a lot of different ways, but it has its origins between farm income in Guatemala and a lot of the Central American countries being impacted, and that's really what kind of typically motivates social unrest, right? It's when you have a declining living standard, and what you're making today is X less than yesterday and Y less from the year before, that's usually what causes a lot of churn. And my biggest fear, because you can pick a thing that maybe is your hot button, be it polar bears, melting glaciers, or whatever. To me, it's just a social upheaval and a societal risk. And that's obviously what leads our Defense Department to say it's a threat multiplier, because they see how this will provide the underlying current to an awful lot of disruption that may sometimes lead us to a war. So to me, this is just a small listing of the things that will result. But then if you kind of begin to think about it in a more quantifiable way, some organizations you don't necessarily associate as being green groups, like Moody's, a bunch of hard calculating actuaries and accountants, they're now calculating that the impact of climate change will be $69 trillion by the end of the year. Actuaries, there's 3 actuarial societies in North America. They've recently done a survey. They're now sensing climate change as the biggest mover in their threat analysis when they go to calculate what you're going to be paying as a premium for your homeowner's policy. It was the biggest mover and is now listed as the biggest risk going forward. So just to begin to, and this is in the vein of goalposts now, because we'll start talking about our football analogy. So, just to maybe pause and just backtrack a little bit here. So we're talking about CO2. We're talking about 80% of it, the human contribution originating from the burning of fossil fuels. We talk about it being in the air for hundreds or thousands of years, and the heating effect that it has. So that's where you get this bucket analogy, that if you think about this bucket as filling up with the human-caused CO2 that we've been dumping into the atmosphere, you can see how we've been increasing it from starts at 1879 to 1958. And the capacity of the bucket is defined as,
Yeah, we try not to touch the microphone.
Okay.
I think you wrapped it.
okay, sorry.
Wow, I didn't think I'd be that effective.
Yeah.
I should take on climate change.
And I'm the IT guy, and I couldn't figure that out. But anyway, so this bucket, the volume of the bucket is defined by how much CO2 can we put into the air that gets us up to that upper limit that the scientists feel comfortable about before you get to some really potentially uncontrollable things. So if you think about that as a budget, we basically have a bucket that we had when the Industrial Revolution started, and we've been steadily filling it up. The more coal, oil, and gas we burnt, has been resulting in emissions, and we've been putting in the air, and what we put in 1950 is largely still there. What we put there in 1960 is largely still there, and that bucket is filling up, and when it breaches the top is when you get to that threshold that a lot of scientists encourage us, and that's really what's behind, if you read any of the press, behind the numbers of 1.5 centigrade. I always translate everything to what we know more naturally as Fahrenheit. But the goal of trying to stay below 2.7 degrees of warming. And just to state the obvious, and you may not have connected all the dots, we've already encountered 2% of that, right? 2 degrees of that. So we're running out of runway. So we've got the guidance from the world's best minds that we really should make best efforts to stay below 2.7. We're already 2 there, running out of runway. And that's where you get to that little remaining amount that's left on the top of the bucket to fill up. And that's then when you backtrack, you get to these goalposts that you hear very often expressed by politicians and climate scientists. In order to not let the bucket overflow, we really need to make best efforts to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 and get to effectively net zero by 2050. So that's how we get there, is think by just connecting all the attributes that we know about. We know where the emissions come from, we know the effect of the emissions, and we know about the cumulative effect, and that's where you get to this budget analogy. So the key takeaways at this point, then again, just by way of a mini little recap, CO2 emissions are largely irreversible, like I said, staying there for hundreds of years. And if we're going to get to 50% by 2030 and the net zero by 2050, doesn't mean we just need to start thinking about this problem in the year 2029 and figure out a way of cutting it by half, and then 2049 and figuring out a way of stopping it. We're already way, way, way under the gun and really need to kind of make best efforts because there's a lot of change that's needed. And that's where I would advise we really need to start thinking about strong action now, of which the good news is we're going to talk about some, but there's much, much more that's needed. So, as Mike introduced, I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby, and what we kind of view as how to deal with the problem is really kind of broken down into this chart. When you read the polling that various institutions do, the good news is climate has really risen up. There's much, much more people that are alarmed, that are concerned. The skeptics are ever decreasing part of the surveys. So the first thing is to turn that concern to where people are realizing into action. And then we really, because I do a lot of these conversations, and I hear people talk about how they put LEDs in their house and swapped out their light bulbs. Maybe they bought an EV, and that's all good. But at the end of the day, what I've heard from people that estimate this stuff is personal actions can only affect 10% of the problem. So in order to get to the crux of this and really turn this thing around, that's where we really need public policy, and then ultimately taking the policies and executing them. So we'll talk about that in the next few slides. So as I've said, I've been doing this a while, and we've now moved on to the second agenda item of finally some climate progress. And this is where, for the last couple of years now, we've had a number of things done that are really beginning to, flatten that curve. So we'll start with a whole bunch of executive orders that were done back in 2021, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, revoking some pipeline initiatives, and establishing a goal for the federal government to be carbon neutral by 2050. That was then followed by the infrastructure bill, which even though it was a bipartisan infrastructure bill, actually had lots of money included for things to begin to jumpstart the conversion of public transit to more carbon-friendly approaches, funding research and innovation, funding a lot of R&D for battery research, doing things like rare earth mineral mapping to drive the development of battery-powered transportation and things, as well as beginning to fund some clean school buses. And a lot of communities now have electric school buses. So the infrastructure bill in and of itself started us moving there in a big way. But then obviously the big thing is the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last summer, which really is the largest investment by the government in climate change ever. It kind of adds up to like $385 billion, and that's a good chunk of money. But what's even better is that the things that this initiates really is going to drive at least $650 billion in private investment. So really, it's like $1 trillion of sorts of being able to, fund this transition of basically two industries, right? Because the one thing I should have said earlier when we talked about that 80% coming from the burning of fossil fuels, generally speaking, that's half in our energy sector and half in our transportation sector. So what you'll then see in terms of this investment is really similarly oriented to those two sectors of EV tax credits, clean energy production. It's very much, when you follow this topic, you'll hear either about carrots or sticks. Are we going to penalize folks or are we going to encourage folks? This was very much a carrot-driven policy. So a lot of tax credits for solar, wind, batteries, EVs, and critical minerals. Loans to fund the building of EVs. I won't read through each of these points. The green bank is actually a very powerful, because that's where you get that multiplication effect. Because the green bank, in theory, would have all of its loans repaid. So really, it's a way of really driving a lot of private investment. And by putting the $250 billion in loan authority is how you can get that multiplication effect going beyond the basic investment that was made. So a whole lot of things was in there. And then, the top of the slide is kind of like the completion of the Inflation Reduction Act. it did have some tax credits for carbon sequestration to kind of really begin to test more fully the proposition that, is there a possibility to burn some things like fossil fuels and properly deal with the emissions? So, it's not a huge investment, but it really kind of tests the case as to whether that will work. Aviation biofuels, which, is one of the harder nuts to crack about how do we get airplanes to stay up in the sky, very unlikely them to be electrified, very likely that they can have a zero-emission biofuel as a source. And then what's in the box is a methane fee. So for the first time, we're now establishing a price to be paid on what is the negative effects of an emitted gas. So for the first time, it starts off at $36 per ton of emissions, growing to $60 per ton, and then it provides that money for methane reductions, monitoring, and reporting. So this, we're very intrigued with this kind of approach because we think this is the basis for other approaches that can be followed to deal with the problem. So the fact that there was a methane fee, we think is a very good step in the right direction. And it doesn't get covered a lot, but you may have heard about another, it was voted on a bipartisan basis, the CHIPS Act, which really had as a basis investment in some things like semiconductor manufacturing in the US and that stuff. But that in and of itself has $67 billion. A quarter of it was climate related. So between the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and even this CHIPS Act, there's really been a whole chock full of things done that are all good things that are driving us to more of a decarbonized society. Looking at this a different way than, more in a personal, local level, there are going to be rebates now available for doing a lot of things around the house. So, changing out your water heater, putting in a heat pump, converting from gas clothes dryers to electric, rebates for households to make improvements to increase your energy efficiency, a lot of more tax credit extensions for solar panels. The projections are that from that bill alone, 280,000 additional homes in Illinois will actually probably take avail of themselves of the rebate and install solar panels where they otherwise would not have. So a lot of things in it, both locally, individually for the folks here at all different levels. But what I would encourage, because what I found, and I just learned this somewhat recently, is that you may remember how Puerto Rico, well, they've had two hurricanes, right? The bigger one was Irma, I think 3-4 years ago. And in response to that, there was a huge relief package passed by government to, help mitigate the damage. I think as we're sitting here today, 4 years later, less than 20% of the money was actually expended. So one of the concerns with the Inflation Reduction Act is making sure that people are aware of it. So I would encourage those of you who are here that are active in your local communities, maybe have a relationship with a school board member, have some sort of a relationship with your village board or whatever, tout the fact that there probably is going to be a chunk of money for your school districts, for your local transit agencies, for your local communities to avail yourselves of that money that I just referred to that's all included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So, President Biden was very sensitive that he wanted to make sure this didn't wind up like the Puerto Rico thing where you allocate money and 5-6 years later, the majority of the money is still unspent. So I would encourage you that if this is a topic that interests you and you agree with the goal of the initiative, learn more about it and then get involved with your local communities. I know I have already pinged my village trustees, and it's something that is a way of bringing it very close to home. So what this all means then, in this chart again, I'll kind of walk you through it. This is the yearly greenhouse gas emissions, both historically and from a projection standpoint. And as you can see with the red line, doesn't get touted a lot, but we've already encountered a 27% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions from 2005. Now, all of this, depending on your own personal feelings, is not entirely positive because a lot of it was driven by the opening up of the fracking industry for oil, which when they started fracking, released or uncovered huge amounts of natural gas. So it presented a good opportunity to kind of go from coal to natural gas, and that was one of the bigger drivers, along with, Energy Star appliances and emission standards for your car. But at the end of the day, we did in fact get a 27% cut. The Inflation Reduction Act then gets us to 40%. So it's been touted a lot about being 40%. Very few people know we already had 27% kind of in the bank. So think about it in terms of Inflation Reduction Act contributed 13% to where we hope to get. And obviously where we want to get to meet the Paris targets as well as the IPCC targets is to get to a 50% cut by 2030. So we're basically, so here's my football analogy. I know Mark was looking forward to this slide. So if you kind of bring it all together, and I redid my presentation just as the Bears season was looking more promising than it turned out to be, so that's why maybe now I wouldn't have done this. But if you start with where we are, we have in fact moved down to, I won't move away from the microphone because then I'm sure that'll mess up the YouTube. But if you kind of look at, the past actions that have done, we got to a 27% level. If you then kind of factor in the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, that's where we're on target to get to 2030. But just as the Bears always have a hard time in the red zone, we're not even anywhere near the red zone, right? So we're at the 40%, but if you remember that carbon bucket and that carbon budget, it really, is incumbent upon us to figure out a way of getting to the goal line. And that's where there's a lot of green field ahead of us here. So, what I would argue as a key takeaway at this point is that, the way we got here was through a lot of regulations and a lot of incentives. Like I said, the Inflation Reduction Act was largely carrot-based by giving tax credits and stuff away. But we really need to get our sights, because in some ways that's actually the low-hanging fruit. We really need to figure out how do we take the tougher nut and how do we get to the remaining 60%. And that's where, what's worked to get us to this point may not work going forward. So the reason I say that is, that 40% and the 13% that IRA is contributing is really truly some of the lower hanging fruits. Emissions are just endemic to the economy, right? The sources of it are all over the place. All sorts of things, result in emissions. And I, for one, would think it's problematic that we're going to get to the next 60 yards by regulating our way there. I for one, what happens with a regulation is that you have to, for one, pass it as a law, and then you have to, and what happens when you're thinking about that? A whole bunch of lobbyists, and not the volunteer type like Mark and I, but the paid type, swing into action. What do? They try to wordsmith the thing. Why? To get a whole bunch of loopholes in the thing, and water it down, and then maybe something half-baked does make it into law, and then what happens? Everybody tries to sue and tie the thing up in courts, which can easily tie up 8 to 10 years. Well, if we're going to get to where we need to be to by 2030, we don't have 10 years to be playing around in courts. So that's where to me, it's very problematic that we can get what needs to get done through regulations. And that's where a price on carbon, and we're going to talk about that for the remainder of our 15 minutes, to me is really viewed very much as one of the most effective things we can do, and most importantly, one of the most timely things that will have a major impact. So it's based on a very simple concept, right? It's something that every one of us, factors in every time we walk into a 7-Eleven or go anywhere else, right? You think about the cost of something, and something that is cheaper than another thing, you kind of look at it, and it's otherwise comparable, it kind of becomes favorable. So, there's a lot of ways I would say this makes sense, but it's really how do we make fossil fuels reflect their true cost when you factor in that $69 trillion worth of damage that Moody's had, 10 slides ago, because that's really the cost of that product that never appears on their P&L or their balance sheet. I know some people in the room here live by balance sheets and P&L statements, like my friend Mark, but all that external cost that society pays never shows up on a financial statement. So that's where making that product more expensive to me is arguably a fair thing to do from a lot of perspectives, not the least of which is you're attaching a true cost to that product, a cost that goes beyond just what appears narrowly in a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement. So what we would suggest is putting a fee on carbon, and 3 basic components, and each of them has a very interesting role to play. So the first is putting a carbon fee on the extraction of that fossil fuel when it comes out of the ground to make it reflect the cost of that product, not just the extraction cost and the marketing cost and the profitability of it, but the true cost that society is paying. Then for that money that's collected, return it to households equally. Don't use it as a means to fund government. Don't use it as a means to grow government. Keep it revenue neutral from a government budget point of view. And then thirdly, knowing that you are going to be affecting trade, do all you can at the border to unwind it, to make it a zero-sum kind of game. And we'll talk about each of these more in the next few slides. So basically the construction of my organization's approach to this is to have a carbon fee along with a household dividend, a carbon dividend, combined with a border carbon adjustment. And we'll talk briefly about all 3 elements. So doing this has the effect of, it will raise the cost of fossil fuel, it will raise the cost of those products, but the dividend then offsets it. So that's how the 2 kind of plays together, is that you want to make the alternative things that are renewable based, that are carbon free, relatively speaking, become more and more competitive when compared up against the fossil fuel. Because right now, an internal combustion car is cheaper than an EV. Getting a gallon of gas and the energy output you get is cheaper than paying at a charging station. So by making that fossil fuel a bit more expensive, begins to crack open that door of making the renewable competitive products compare more favorably. To give you a little, and we're obviously going to need to stay at a high level because I'm within 10 minutes, but that dividend then, just to kind of tell you how this would work out, becomes a substantial portion. So ultimately, collecting that fee that does go up every year, keeping it out of government by returning it to American households, there would obviously be a bell-shaped curve to it, because eventually, while you're on the upside, the carbon fee does go up every year, but eventually you're going to kind of turn the tide on the use of fossil fuels, and then you're going to have that fall off on the backside. But at the peak, it's generally speaking about a $2,900 payment that would reflect that carbon dividend for an average household of 4, which is not, it's not a government giveaway. It's not, it offsets the higher costs you are going to be paying. So the way the math actually works out, like the lowest 60% of income households either break even, or maybe they make $100 or $200, $100 or $200 more per year. So it's generally just an offset, because those folks are already living paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford to help fund this transition. So the whole benefit of the carbon dividend is a way of keeping the lower 60% of households whole, or maybe a tad better. That's very much very minimal. I could talk along. I have 2 slides on why I think this makes sense. But to me, the cost and impacts of climate change are growing, as we've kind of talked at the outset of this presentation, and it does have a quantifiable cost to it. Fossil fuel companies are, most companies don't have the benefit of not internalizing all the cost of their products, right? I mean, I'm thinking about all the companies I worked for, and I never can necessarily think of a company where a large chunk of the effects of it that are negative don't appear on your financial statements. So that's where, along with some tax breaks that are still in the tax code, fossil fuel companies still get big tax breaks, not the least of which is the climate damage they cause doesn't show up anywhere. And that pricing pollution levels the playing field. We're really not giving any money. This isn't like a carrot approach to renewables. We're simply, because they don't have that same stigma of climate cost associated with them, we're simply leveling the playing field and giving them a better opportunity to succeed. Because it's an economic-driven thing, you avoid that regulation pitfall where you have to write a regulation for every little usage. Just by making the thing more costly, and you're going to make it more costly because you're going to attach that cost the minute it comes out of the ground, you're incentivizing every business, all of whom want to maximize their profitability, every consumer that's sensitive to their financials, So it drives millions of decisions just because you made the thing more expensive. You don't have to regulate and tell somebody to do something. They're all going to do that automatically because everybody is personally greedy and wants to minimize cost. Carbon pricing has an awful lot of support from a lot of organizations, and we're going to go through this somewhat quickly, but you know, of the 180 signatories to the Paris Climate Accord, as memory serves me, 85 of them on day one, 10 years ago, indicated carbon pricing as their strategic initiative to getting to the emission reductions that they were signing up for. So the World Bank supports it and has been a big promoter of it. The United Nations Global Compact, World Resources Institute, which is a fine organization, I've attended several of their sessions, you know, all have come out very much for carbon pricing. Well, here's the current snapshot of where things are. 65 carbon pricing initiatives have already been selected, and 45 of them are already at a national level and are covered by initiatives. And this kind of gives the breakdown, and you can see all the green, purple blobs based on what type of carbon pricing they implemented, but you can already see the wide support adopted by, you know, almost all European countries, our friends up north in Canada, and even, you know, in other parts of the world. So carbon pricing is a very popular item. It's not a new thought, and it's certainly not, you know, an American unique thought. I was introduced as an economist. That was more not by work, but by schooling. And you know, there's been no grouping of economists that have ever rallied around something as much as this. So 3,400 economists have signed on that, you know, looking at things about what would be the impact on the economy and how do you do it in a way that grows the economy and doesn't harm the economy. 3,400 of them, or 3,623, I guess this is an updated slide, you know, have signed on that carbon fee and dividend is far and away the preferred approach. And then, you know, we don't talk about it much these days, but we always look for wide support across the political spectrum. And when you look at the 15 former councils of economic advisors, it's almost evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. So this is a kind of a policy that really does have broad appeal across the spectrum because of how it is low government, low regulation, no government revenue, and protects the lower income, really has kind of the appeal for broad-based support politically. So what it kind of does, you know, when you kind of think about this policy, I'll go through this even quicker than I have the last few. Businesses, and we're going to talk a lot about business support that this kind of approach has gotten. It drives the development of clean energy. It's the most affordable climate policy. I've personally followed some studies that when you try to do something via alternative means, you know, when you dictate something, that's usually not the most cost-effective way. There's usually a lot of inherent inefficiencies in that approach, whereas when you simply make the thing you want to have go away and let others all look at it in economic terms and figure out what's best for them, is really where you get it to be the most efficient, the most affordable way of getting there. Because we're not taking money out of the economy, because that's what a tax would do. You know, anytime you tax something, it becomes one less dollar to be spent on anything else, but there's a recycling to this aspect because of the carbon dividend, and because renewable jobs are basically 3 to 1 more job intensive compared to their fossil fuel equivalents, you actually have a situation where you have the opportunity to create jobs and maintain a strong economy. So just begin to think about what this kind of a policy would have. This is a plot. That green line is kind of what we have paid for people to look at and have calculated, but now we have universities that are doing it on their own nickel just to kind of confirm it, are finding that this kind of a carbon fee and dividend approach where you put in a fee starting at $15 and then going up $10 or $15 a year, which is a very modest approach, would actually get you to the 100% net zero reduction for fossil fuels that we have as a target by 2050. You know, what this then drives is basically two things. One, you want to fully decarbonize the grid. You know, we're obviously already moving down that way with wind turbines and both offshore and onshore. solar panels, both industrial scale and on people's homes. So it's really the goal to decarbonize the grid. We also are going to have to build in energy storage and really kind of break down a lot of barriers so we can move electricity across the country from where it can be produced to where it's needed. And then, more locally, it's electrify everything, right? We've already started taking some baby steps in my house. I already had that hard conversation with my wife and talked her out of her gas dryer, and we now have an electric one. She was convinced her, comforter wasn't going to come dry, and sure enough, it dried the same way. So all those kinds of things, my EV, which I normally would have driven here, I ordered it September of 2021. I was supposed to have it in March. Still waiting for it. They're telling me they're going to build it next week. So hopefully that comes through after the 6th rescheduling. But those are the kinds of things then that this enables, right? Because you're making that fossil fuel-based thing more expensive. It gives more and more an incentive to pursue the electrified equivalent. And then because of the prior slide, the electricity will be produced in a carbon-free way. Lastly, I'm going to go through this, and this is a very important one too, though, so I'm going to go through this fast, but I'm going to kind of make a lot of emphasis because this doesn't get a lot of coverage, but there's a really interesting political angle to this thing, is border carbon adjustment. So I kind of talked about the 3 components of a carbon fee, right? You put a fee on when you take the stuff out of the ground, you return all the money to dividend, and then I said you make everything equal in terms of shipping things in or out to make sure you don't impact negatively or positively importers or exporters. I know you're not going to be able to see this slide. What doesn't get properly appreciated is how clean the U.S. already is. So in that first column that has the little red line around it is basically setting as a baseline how much carbon does the U.S. use to produce that product. So there's all sorts of different industries there, be it industrial materials, be it textiles, be it whatever. And in that first column with the red circle is what is the U.S. basis of carbon effectiveness to produce that item. And then when you look at these other countries between Canada, EU, Russia, China, if it's a red box, that means that they are more carbon inefficient. They drive more emissions than the U.S. does. So if you now start thinking about a carbon border adjustment that makes those companies that release more emissions pay more for that, you can see how in broad swaths of the economy, U.S. is actually sitting with a competitive advantage. And this then leads to a lot of interesting things. So U.S. firms are among the cleanest in the world, even in carbon-intensive industries. The U.S. carbon advantage in manufacturing is 40% better than the world average, 3 times that of China, 4 times that of India. 75% of what we import comes from a country that is less carbon efficient than us, which means they would have to pay more in order to import it here. It enables the U.S. to outcompete foreign production with our carbon advantage, and like the U.S. steel industry, and that was my first job out of college, would become 40% more profitable because of how cleanly we produce a ton of steel compared to other global competitors. So this is an economic plus to us, and what I really like is how it's drawing some unlikely folks. So if you don't know who Senator Kramer is from the North Dakota, he's about as conservative as a conservative will come. And look at what I'll just read the underline, he is one of the biggest proponents of a carbon fee, a border carbon adjustment, because it demonstrates a model of clean and efficient production for other nations to emulate. The vast majority of our constituents believe that there is climate change, and that he is one of the biggest supporters for putting a border carbon adjustment. A conservative Republican from North Dakota, which is not where you would typically look for support of climate policies, is evoking those kind of responses. So the rest of the slide is kind of a rehash of the prior one. I will say that even the World Trade Organization is supporting this, and because they always look for fairness, and they would agree that putting more of a focus on climate actually is a way of something that they could see themselves supporting. So with trying to begin to wrap this up and go into the 4th quarter of the presentation, Mark, we'll kind of go back to a slide that we had. So we left earlier on getting to that 40%. And then if you remember what a carbon fee and dividend looked like getting us to the 100%, putting those 3 things on in the red box, a carbon tax, a carbon dividend and a border carbon adjustment gets us well over 95%, right up to 100% by 2050. Where we are seeing support for this, and again, it's very much counterintuitive, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that has not historically been a huge climate advocate. I think this changed in August of 2020. They are now calling for a policy that is practical, flexible, predictable, and durable, AKA something economic-based and not regulatory-based, very much like a carbon fee and dividend. The Business Roundtable, I've worked for large companies that have frequently been members of the Business Roundtable. They now are talking about the same kind of support to leverage a market-based solution wherever possible and provide the predictability that a carbon fee would provide. And then last but not least, the American Petroleum Institute, of all people, is actually saying that of all the ways that, because they kind of see the handwriting on the wall, we're going to have to do something about climate, their preference would be for a carbon fee-based policy. So in summary, hopefully I made the claim that doing something with the climate is a good thing. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it, both in terms of health. The bottom bullet kind of talks about the reduced hospitalization and reduced deaths from pollutants, crop losses. But, hopefully, maybe not through this presentation, but through your own research, you will conclude that there's an overwhelming case for climate action, and that, one of the best ways of dealing with it is a carbon pricing with dividend, builds on the momentum we have, and then provides all the right incentives for us to do that much, much harder part of the problem, which is the remaining 60%, now that we've done some of the low-hanging fruit with the first 40. You like that picture there, Mark? I thought that was a nice, I know you're a Bears fan. So the 6 takeaways in terms of summaries are CO2 well, you know what, I'm not going to read through this because I know I'm running out of time, so I think I'll turn this over to questions. But this was simply a recap of the things I highlighted along the way that I would, and I'll make this presentation available if anybody wants it. But, what's really needed is, beyond personal actions, we really need to drive that public policy, and the way we're going to get the public policy is by encouraging our leaders to have the political backbone to take this on. And, if you'd like to get involved, there's a way of joining with us. Other than that, I'll say thank you and open this up to any questions.
Well, we're going to try to use the microphone. So,
explain why the United States has been such balking at it when they seem to have such manufacturing advantage.
Why the U.S. is what?
Why the USA has balked at a lot of climate policies internationally and hasn't taken a vast leadership position when they seem to, when other countries are seemingly willing to go along.
Well, yeah, I'd say you'd always have to look back to where does that resistance have its source. So, at the end of the day, the fossil fuel industry is a large portion of our economy, and they do, through that position, have the ability to exert influence. So they, have an inherent reason not to necessarily get on board. And I would say that ultimately drives an awful lot because, when you look at how, politics are funded and through dark money, there's a lot of reasons that, the fossil fuel industry is obviously the big, kahuna that wants to resist, right? And it has its effect.
they're maintaining a status quo, let's say, that seems to work for them and not looking for big changes.
Well, I mean, in all honesty, if you work for an oil company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the profits to your shareholders, right? So I'd say it goes beyond status quo. They want to become larger, right? I mean, and quite honestly, they're somewhat driven to that by needing to represent the investments of their shareholders. So there's a natural conflict there.
In the last couple of decades, we outsourced so many things. The companies, it's making it cheaper overseas, and they want to bring it back in their country without tariff. So even though they're U.S. companies, they're making it overseas, and they want to keep it cheap coming in.
Yep. And that's true. Yep. Well, you see, that's one of the benefits then, right? Because if you take at face value what you just said, cheap, right? It's perhaps unnaturally cheap because it doesn't reflect the damage that's being done from the emissions of where it was manufactured, right? And that's really where, my argument would be that putting a carbon fee is actually a fair, accountable thing to do, because by moving it offshore, you were able to reduce the cost, but you increased other costs that that company doesn't pay for, right? For that person that, has their home underwater because of sea level rise, all the things that were on that prior slide, and more extreme weather events, and the fact that, hurricanes now have, more extensive rain downfalls. All those kinds of things are costs that are not included. And by putting a carbon fee or a border carbon adjustment, that's where the border carbon adjustment would hit, that is the fact that you as a company chose to move something from here to there, you reduced your cost by X, but you increased other costs to society by Y, you would factor that back in, and all of a sudden it wouldn't look quite as cheap. And that's where the advantage comes in, where this actually would be, this kind of a policy would be very friendly to American economy, because we are able to produce things with less emissions. Yes.
It seems like part of your talk talked about how we hit the low-hanging fruit and we got the things that were pretty easy to do and the rest is going to be a slog. And then you also go into the point of saying that by initiating what seems like a fairly logical and simple thing, according to CCL, the Citizens Climate Lobby, we can get 95% or 100% of the way there. And so those two don't completely jive up with me. And as I look at it, I think it's easy to look at this whole problem and get dispirited and say, yeah, we picked some low-hanging fruit and we've got to really get moving and do the things that maybe are going to be tougher and have a much bigger impact on everyone's personal life. Yet then you're saying that instituting this dividend that maybe won't even hurt people too much may get us there. And so I sense a discrepancy there. I don't know if you see
Well,
that or can respond.
I would break into two parts, right? One is establishing the policy, separate from the policy being in place, how it would work. So I think the execution of it would be very efficient, because of how it does it without regulation. And the one point I didn't make earlier is that, when you think about the time urgency, a lot of this, the ability for government to tax, which is what a carbon fee is, even though it gets returned as a dividend, is pretty much beyond reproach. And that's where you avoid that 6 to 8 year court litigation delay, because it's very much not open to challenge, because the government can choose to tax whatever it wants to. So that's where I would say the execution of a carbon fee policy is, I hate to use the word simple because nothing about this issue is simple, but it's straightforward, and it works because you're playing into the motivations of everybody who wants to reduce their bottom line, right? The hard part is on the political side, getting it established, and that's where, Citizens Climate Lobby has been advocating this for 15 years, and we still don't have it. So I think that's proof. It's not easy up front.
Right.
It's really on the political will, and that's where I think there's a role for a lot of folks here in this room, because quite honestly, what a lot of folks would say, the thing we can all do, and it's, some people don't mind being on a lobby call, some people don't mind carrying a sign. Best thing you could do is to just talk to a neighbor over your fence post and say, hey, what do you think about it? Do you think anything's changing? What would you do about it? A lot of folks would say that just more we talk about it will inherently be the segue to the political will that ultimately allows our officials to maybe go somewhere because they are going to pay a price with the fossil fuel industry. That's why you have to kind of admit that if somebody were to be leading on this, they probably are going to forego a lot of political contributions from one segment of the economy, right? And that's where I think the best thing for anybody to do is to just talk about it with your neighbor, talk about it with your elected officials, and just make it known what your views are.
Well, yeah, with the Congress now going to be split between the two parties, a lot of environmental organizations just talk to one side of the aisle. Is there an organization that would be effective in talking to both sides?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want this to turn us into a Citizens Climate Lobby commercial, but at the end of the day,
I think you should for a little bit.
no, but we are a nonpartisan group, and we don't use the term because, quite honestly, there was probably more of an appetite for it 15 years ago. If you would have heard me talk about this years ago, what I would have emphasized is the bipartisan nature of the solution. But quite honestly, with where elections go these days, I don't know if that appetite is still there in the American economy, so we don't necessarily emphasize it. But we would have always argued that you can't afford, because of what needs to get done between now and 2050, you can't change course every 4 years, every 8 years when you have an election. You need to be on a straight line, and the only way you're going to do that is compromise whatever you need to make sure that when the boat leaves the dock, it's got Republicans and Democrats and left and right and everybody on board. And that's where, we've always stood for that. And things have changed a little bit with COVID, but I know certainly right before COVID, when we would do one of our lobby events I think in June of 2019, what are there? There's 435 congressmen and women and 100 that. We didn't get to all 535. I think we cut off at 529. I think we were 9 short. So some people were on vacation and we couldn't connect with them, but yes. So we think it's important to talk to everybody, and we don't, I've had doors slammed in my face because people didn't want to hear it, but that really is changing, and I think it really just starts by talking about this and being respectful, and we don't do any kind of grandiose tying ourselves to trees or anything. It's less like, what are your beliefs, and try to move you along to something that gets you closer to the goal line.
It seems like you're having, maybe 5 years ago or so, there was more talk in terms of the pairing up of people. You wanted to have one Democrat and one Republican together join these. You couldn't join unless you brought someone from the other party with you into the lobby group as an elected representative. And are you seeing that change? Are you seeing more people, more representation, more positive attitudes towards the points of view that are there than there were?
Yeah, I mean, you're referring to the bipartisan climate caucus, and yes, I mean, I think for 6-7 years advocated it and couldn't recruit anybody, and then in the course of like 3 years, I think we went from 2 to, what was the final number, 120 or something? But that's fallen a little bit out of vogue because I think I think the sense was some people piggybacked on it just for their own political benefit without necessarily doing anything hard. And that's where I think there was ultimately a falling back that says, there needs to be a cost of admission, that if you want to be part of the bipartisan caucus, you need to actually do something. You just can't come along for a free ride to say, yeah, I'm concerned about the topic, but I'm not willing to do anything about it. So I think, that aspect of the caucus isn't quite there. But I can tell you offhand, I mean, a true story. I wasn't joking. There was one congressman who should remain nameless. We had a scheduled meeting with him, and it happened to be the Tuesday after the Thursday that Trump got out of the Paris Climate Accord. The aide was there at the door. He said, no need to come in. President Trump what needed to be done, and there was nothing to talk about because we're out of the Paris Climate Accord agreement. Well, 4 years later, we had the warmest possible welcome by that same exact congressman who talked about, from a farm community, how his constituents are talking about it. He even praised our solution as appealing to conservatives. I mean, so that's where you individually see a lot of movement, right? But obviously when you watch the news, I think a lot of news sources are just, naturally biased to becoming more sensational and not talk about things that are, maybe more uplifting. They don't drive clicks.
All right. Well, I know I did want to mention this Potsdam Institute,
Sure.
A short thing about that, and I just started looking into it a little bit, so I don't have a lot of knowledge about it. And basically, I think it's a group looking at climate change issues and talking about something like 2,000 options that they've determined how ways are to achieve less than 2 degrees of climate of warming. And then they started looking at ways to achieve it, and some were high overflow. Is that what they called it, Mark? I should give you this and talk from the podium, but.
No, I didn't read the whole article, but I did get the article, and it does look interesting. And they just talked about different scenarios. They had like 1,500 different scenarios they looked at, and then they talked about some that they called overshoot. in which the temperature went way up too high in the middle years, like 250 to 260 or something, but then came back down and still made it to the goal by 2100.
And that was too potentially scary in terms of the fact what could occur, the complete
Yeah.
loss of the Antarctic ice shelf or Greenland ice shelf
Yeah.
while you get to those high levels. So they backed out certain issues and they came up with other solutions
Right.
that still seem possible.
Right, they categorized them into 3 different categories, like really unlikely to relatively likely. And
Reasonable,
then,
yeah.
And then reasonable, and then sort of in the middle. And when they looked at the reasonable ones, it looked like it was hard to find a good reasonable one that would really work. So then they had to look at the ones that were more difficult in the middle to try and come up with a solution. But yeah, it's an interesting article.
Yeah, it was in the Washington Post, or you can look up Potsdam Institute if you're interested. And other than that, I think it had similarities to your bucket analogy, this full bucket and how close we're getting to full and what options we have. The options get less and less the longer you wait and the longer you delay, which is, the basic maybe learning point of it all, right? All right, well, thank you very much. It was wonderful talk. I thought it was highly enlightening. It's nice to see. I thought it was, for a while, worrisome and then got kind of optimistic, which is probably what you need to do.
Just don't turn the Bears game, you'll probably be disappointed again.
Yeah. But, thank you very much for coming, and the Citizens Climate Lobby has always presented us with great information and great ways of looking at things, and I know that a lot of people in our community have acted in ways from putting solar panels on to doing a lot of different energy-saving options, and you guys have been a big part of it, so we thank you all.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. Scott will be here in 2 more weeks talking about pictures from the new the space telescope, the James Webb Telescope that's out there, and kind of relating them to Christmas ornaments, I think, like he does so beautifully with astrophysics things. So that's 2 weeks from today, and thanks so much for all of you for coming, and thanks so much to the Citizens Climate Lobby for the things you do for all of us. All right, thanks.